agree with him, actually. And this is a point of agreement, actually, between me and Edward. And I think the reason why he's using this argument is potentially because he had conversations with Christians before, where the theology is a little bit different. But the premise is true. What Edward is saying is absolutely correct. In fact, if God doesn't reveal himself to you and then punishes you as a result, this is unjust. And that's why the Quran says, وَمَا كُنَّ مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا, chapter 17, verse 15, that we were not going to punish them until we sent them a messenger. So scholars of Islam said, even if you die an atheist, or a Hindu, or a Christian, and even though you're born with this fitrah, with this predisposition, which wasn't tackled, hopefully he'll talk about it, this predisposition to believe in God, which we have evidence for now, even though all of that is in place, God will still not punish those individuals until they're given sufficient exposure. And that is exactly correct. I think you're right.
Thank you. The next question is directed towards Muhammad. So it's basically the case of bad design in science. There is a concept of vestigial futures, futures that are a hindrance or otherwise less than perfect in many organisms. If the universe runs without inconsistency, what would explain vestigial futures? And the particular example that was given is the woman's pelvis, which is far too small and creates a very difficult and painful birthing process.
Well, I think this is called the argument of ignorance. Just because you don't know the function of something, it doesn't mean it's functionless. So for example, we don't know what the appendix does. It doesn't mean it has no function. It just means we haven't discovered that yet. We don't know why two electrons can be in one place at the same time on quantum mechanics. It doesn't mean that's a false notion, even though it goes against the rules of logic and it goes against some of the things, conventions that we believe in. So just because you don't know something, it doesn't make it false. So that's the first point. As for the second point of bad design, I mean, who's the judge of bad design? I mean, at least with the fine-tuning argument, you have some kind of probability, mathematical probability that can be attached to this kind of equation. You're saying that the chances of there not being, a universe, or the universe having a non-life permitting range is X, which is a mathematical kind of rendering. So here, we have to be kind of honest here and say that this is an aesthetic value judgment at best. And aesthetic value judgments are not our opinions, frankly. They're your opinion. If you see something that's bad design, that's your opinion. You might think it's bad design, but there might be a reason. Now, there's one more thing I want to add, because I've got a minute left. I think people have misunderstood my argument from uniformity. I'll add it to the conclusion. Like my good friend Firas Zahabi mentioned one time in a podcast that I've done with him. For example, let's take a coin. If we flip a coin, it can either be heads or tails. Today, we can flip it. It's either going to be heads or tails. Tomorrow it's going to be either heads or tails. We don't expect the coin to be flipped and turned into a butterfly. Why? Because we accept that there's a kind of coherence that exists, there are kind of constants that exist. So in order to do science, you need to know, or you need to presuppose that this uniformity exists. Otherwise, your calculations today will be meaningless tomorrow. And that's why Albert Einstein said that a priori we expect a chaotic universe. Meaning, from the mind, you expect there not to be this kind of order. So this underpins, or is even more undercutting, if you like, than the fine-tuning argument, which is why I presented it. So that's it. Thank you.
The problem is that when you posit a God who is supposed to be all-powerful and morally perfect, then defects in our design are not justified based on those attributes of God. For instance, I pointed out how the gene that can help fight malaria can also cause sickle cell anemia. We know that we humans have back problems because we stood up too soon. We know that there are defects in our bodies. We could be more resistant to cancer. We could be more resistant to viruses. We could have a better digestive system. So God cannot get off the hook here because he is presented as an all-powerful being who is morally perfect. An all-powerful being who is morally perfect doesn't make these missteps in design. And we already know our vulnerability to disease. For instance, we already know that we just have a very few decades to be in good condition, and then as we get older, we begin to decline. And so that's not something that we would expect from a morally perfect God. We wouldn't expect unnecessary pain. If God wants us to take our hand off the fire so we don't get burned, we would expect pain. But if we're trapped in a burning forest and we burn to death painfully, pain has no value. And we wouldn't expect that unnecessary suffering with no purpose on theism. It's more likely on atheism. So given the claims of God's moral perfection and omnipotence, defects in design are not defensible.
Thank you. Next question. This is to you, Edward. You said there is no evidence to prove the existence of God. What proof do you personally need to believe, and how would you recognize that?
You see, this is the difference between me and a religious person. I'm subject to evidence. Religions don't change regardless of the evidence, but an empirically minded atheist like me would. If right now Muhammad and I were levitated to the ceiling, if my father, who was dead for 18 years, walked in this room right now in his inimitable Yiddish accent, and I recognized him asking me why I'm not in my office working, and then floated in the air and said, both of you, Mormonism is the true religion. If Muhammad and I right now were teleported to Mecca, and I saw the most amazing astronomical displays telling me to become a Muslim right away, I would. Now, you might say, well, this is the result of an advanced space alien, but being an evidentialist, I would believe it's a supernatural being until someone showed me that it was advanced space aliens. So the difference between atheists like me and those who subscribe to religion is we are open to changing if we have direct evidence, whereas there very few religious people who would say, if this happened, I would not believe in God, whereas atheists like me can clearly say, if the following things happen, I will believe in God, but we all know they won't happen. But if they did, I would.
Can I add to it?
Yes, we get 2 minutes. We both.
Yeah. The first point on not being religious, it depends on how you define religion. Because frankly, if you take like an Emil Durkheim approach, who's a sociologist, he defined religion in more broad terms than would be found in vernacularly in dictionaries, for example, which has to be through God or whatever. Frankly, you could make the argument that atheist people are very religious, in so much as they have axioms and they have leaps of faith which they believe in. For instance, if we take, for example, science, and especially something like quantum physics, you don't do the experiments yourself. You rely upon witness testimony. You don't go into laboratory and repeat experiments X amount of times in order to believe it. So in order for you to have an understanding of science, you have to have a leap of faith in trusting those individuals who teach you about science, your teachers, your school books, and so on. I mean, you believe in equality. And once again, these are precepts which, frankly, are axiomatic, meaning they don't have any evidence to substantiate them. Even John Locke, who is the founder of liberalism, he based it on God, by the way. And that's why in the Declaration of Independence, created beings is being referred to over and over again. So really, you don't have a epistemic right to talk about equality without having some kind of leap of faith, frankly, in those things. So atheists have faith all the time. They have faith in things they don't see. They have faith in things they don't interact with. And what I'm going to say is that this is where, as John Gray said, some people can wrap discussion of ideology in sociological format and make it seem as if it's a-religious. But in fact, it is actually, in terms of its conventions and epistemic weight, the same as any kind of religious belief. As for levitating and so on, well, you believe in levitating, but it just has to happen in the quantum physics realm where things do levitate and things do float. Harry Potter exists in the quantum physics world, but an atheist would never believe it unless a scientist told them. That's belief, that's faith.
Thank you. Next question to Muhammad. Would God provide us with autonomy, and does that negate the good and evil argument?
Can you read?
Yeah. Would God provide us with autonomy, our free will, and does that negate the good and evil argument?
Yes, so on Islamic traditionalism, God has endowed us with what you call khiyar, or the idea of choice and free will. And in fact, evil is a necessary part of that, because if you don't have evil, you cannot make a decision. There will just be good and good to decide from. You can't decide from good and good. There has to be good and bad. And therefore, you must be tested. A test makes no sense with the non-existence of evil. A test makes no sense with the non-existence of evil. So sometimes the bad thing can be good for you. وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. The Quran says, you could hate something, but it's actually very good for you. And the thing is, on theism, on Islamic theism, we believe in another domain. It's a metaphysical domain, which is Yawm al-Qiyamah, the day of judgment, whereby all of those things that you were wronged in the dunya, the worldly life, you'll be recompensed for that. So we don't believe that when a child dies, that's just a random rearrangement of atoms, as would be the case, by the way, on naturalism. It's a random rearrangement of atoms. If I slap a snowman and I knock his head off, it's the same as if I cut a kid's head off. Because it's just, on naturalism, frankly, it's just, a rearrangement of atoms. And in order for you to make any sense of that, you'd have to impose a subjective value judgment on it, which you'd have to have faith in order to have in the first place. So frankly, what we believe is that the injustices of this world, Hitler, for example, was a very unjust man, killed 6 million individuals. He will be punished, hopefully, perpetually, in a domain in which the punishment is not limited. Justice cannot be done on naturalism. It can only be done on a kind of system, a metaphysical system, which undoes all of the wrongs that happened in this world.
We may not like the implications of a godless world, but that doesn't mean that a God will come into existence just to rescue us from those implications. We may not like the fact that we end at death, but that doesn't mean a God will come about just so that we don't end at death if that God doesn't otherwise exist. The concept of free will is given more credit than it deserves. If you have 2 children, you don't let one of your children push the other off a cliff just so as not to interfere in free will. And so the question of free will, or even the benefits of it, do not justify the extreme pain and the extreme suffering that we undergo. So, for instance, if we need to feel pain when we put our hand on a hot stove, that's understandable. But that pain does not serve a useful purpose if we are being innocently burnt by evil people and we have to suffer that agonizing death. So the fact that there is gratuitous, unnecessary, unexplained, horrendous suffering goes way beyond necessary slight evils and suffering which would have a beneficial and corrective purpose. So we can't say that any amount of suffering or any amount of horrible experience is justified because we need that in which to distinguish the good. Even a small amount of evil or a bearable amount of evil is enough to distinguish the good. It is the presence of unexplained, gratuitous, horrendous suffering that is incompatible with an all-good and all-powerful God.
Thank you. Last question directed towards Edward. To summarize, essentially, Islam provides objective morality. Do you believe there is such a thing as objective morality? And if so, how would you explain why atheists 30 years ago would object to, say, homosexuality?
Well, I believe that there are objective moral values, and they're not prescribed by anybody. There is no lawgiver. Now, I was just asked 30 years ago how atheists would have responded to homosexuality. This actually proves my point. 30 years ago, many atheists may not have recognized the importance of allowing such personal freedom. What that means is not that anybody who condemned persons who love those of the same gender were right or wrong then. It meant that we hadn't yet discovered the truth that these are people that deserve equal rights. So, for instance, in the 1950s, when I was growing up, people would be arrested for being gay. They would be put in prison for being gay. The fact that we don't do that now, and it's been illegal to do so in any state since 2003, shows that the more we evolve, the more we discover these moral truths. Not that somebody invents them and imposes us on them, that by our natural development, we discover these truths. For instance, it used to be that religious people would burn women accused of being witches. But we don't do that anymore because we discovered the moral truth that it's wrong to do that to these women, irrespective of the Bible saying, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." So the more we get away from religious fundamentalist edicts, the more moral and tolerant we become, which shows that morality cannot be dependent on religious fundamentalist or orthodox edicts, because it is our pulling away from them that makes us more moral, more compassionate, and more tolerant. You get 2 minutes.
I get 2 minutes, okay. But I don't know what religious edicts the American founding fathers had used in order to, for at least some period of time, allow slavery, racist slavery, what Stalin used in order to do what he did, what Hitler used, frankly, to do what he did. This is not the work of religion. This is the work of people who use ideological justification in order to commit certain acts. The same way as which it's conceivable to think that some religious people will use religious justification in order to commit certain acts. So I don't think there should be an epistemic preferencing of one thing over another here. I think we should just realize that epistemology drives us to certain forces, certain things, and you can't really say, well, religion is better than non-religion. Once again, that would depend on how you define religion in the first place. But having said all of that, I mean, we've talked a lot about gay rights today and all those things, but on the harm principle, which is what John Stuart Mill proposed, part of social liberalism, that you can do whatever you want so long as you don't harm anyone else, well, frankly, that would entail that sex between a brother and sister or a brother and a brother, so long as there's contraception used and there's no deformed babies, that should be allowed as well. And I haven't seen anyone doing incest right activism in America for a very long time. And frankly, on liberalism, that's what you should do. You know, just because they're a minority group of people that are still in the closet, in the incest closet, it doesn't mean now that they should be treated any less on liberalism. So I think we have to be completely honest with ourselves in our social analysis. And if what we're doing is selecting certain social things which have become popular in the 21st century to make a case about God's existence, then I think really we're being academically disingenuous. So I think at the end of the day, whatever principle you're going to have, you have to apply it across the board. And if it is the harm principle on social liberalism, then incest should be allowed in this country, and people should be able to do that.
Thank you. Final question. This is directed to both of you. Edward, because you began, I'll start with Mohammed. Please address the viability of Pascal's wager.
Well, I mean, Pascal is kind of like, it's not really an argument, to be honest with you, which is why I didn't kind of make it. Pascal was a famous mathematician who talked about, you know, basically making a wager, you know, betting on the fact that God exists because doing otherwise may mean that, you know, you'll die and go to hell and so on, and so therefore it makes sense to do that. What we're saying is that, fair enough, there is some truth in that. I mean, if you think about it, the Quran actually affirms some of that, where it says, you know, قُلْ إِنْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ ثُمَّ كَفَرْتُمْ بِهِ. What if it was from God? What if this was from God and you are disbelieving in it? So it's a thought experiment, right? It's more of a thought experiment rather than an argument. So I think the maximum we can do with it is use it as a thought experiment, make people think about death, you know, make people think about the fact that they're going to die, and what kind of ideology or what kind of belief system they want to have with them when they are in their graves, frankly, because atheism will not do anything as a matter of fact. Now, I'm not saying therefore God exists, because that's not an argument. I've made that clear. It's not an argument to say, well, the implications of atheism is that, you know, you're going to be in the sick bed, you're going to be maybe 75 years old, 1 in 2 people in the United States of America are going to have cancer, just like in the UK according to cancer research. And what is better for you? I mean, to be optimistic that there's going to be continuation of that life, or to know that actually you're going to just become bones and dust. Obviously, from an implications perspective, theism, and especially theism with afterlife implications, has better optimistic implications for you. Your memories will be wiped away, your experiences will be wiped away, and your bodies will be wiped away. That's atheist naturalism. But the implications of theism is that actually there will be continuation. This is just the beginning. And so this is not an argument, but it is an implication.